Hello, welcome to the debate. I'm Papadopoulos. It wasn't enough that the U.S. pulled out of the landmark Iran nuclear deal known as the JCPOA. Now the European signatories, known as the E3, have initiated a dispute mechanism against Tehran. In this edition of the debate, we will look at Iran's reaction, whether the Europeans are signaling once again that they are subservient to the U.S., and whether this just means the end of the JCPOA, even though the Europeans have stated otherwise. First, let's cross on over to Brussels and talk to our correspondent, Jerome Hughes, who joins us. Well, Jerome, at this point, reactions are coming in. We've had a couple important ones from Russia and Iran. If you have that, you can tell that to us and any other information you may have on this.
I will. First of all, though, I'll touch on sort of a debate that just concluded 15 minutes ago in the European Parliament surrounding all of these issues. And the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, he did talk about the dispute mechanism issue. And actually, he tried in a way to downplay the significance of it because he was critical of newspaper reports that this was all about putting new sanctions on Iran and the deal was over and so on. He says, no, the dispute mechanism is actually more about trying to get over the current crisis facing the JCPOA nuclear deal. So he definitely tried to play down the sort of significance of it in that respect. We know that Russia has come out and said that there are no grounds to trigger this dispute mechanism, and expressing concern that it could make the situation much worse in terms of efforts to try and save the Iran nuclear deal. And Iran itself is describing it as a passive move, so indicating there that the Islamic Republic would like to see the EU be more proactive and positive, perhaps even standing up to President Trump rather than just going ahead and basically supporting this dispute mechanism. But there was certainly a change in tone in terms of the European Parliament debate. You know, previously when we have debates surrounding Iran, there's quite a lot of anti-Iran rhetoric. This time there was an element of that. There were dozens of speakers, members of the European Parliament. It was quite a lengthy debate, only concluded in the past 15, 20 minutes. But most of the finger pointing was towards Donald Trump rather than Iran, and describing the assassination, the murder of the Iranian general as a breach of international law, as terrorism. There were calls for the EU to show more autonomy in terms of its foreign policy, not to always be following Washington. The US sanctions against Iran were heavily criticized and were blamed for contributing to the tensions, and also efforts, calls for the EU to make the INSTEX mechanism work. This is the mechanism that would allow trade, in theory, with Iran by bypassing US sanctions, and a lot of calls for the EU to do more to make that work. Also calls for the decision by the Iraqi parliament that all foreign forces should leave Iraq. There were calls that that decision should be respected as well. So, you know, this debate, I think really there has been a mood change, I think definitely within the European Parliament. Before, you had much more nuanced reactions and sort of very much sort of pro-United States in the main, but definitely the majority of the speakers today very heavily critical of President Trump and the unilateral actions that he continues to make, and this sort of anti-Iran sort of hate campaign towards Iran. There was a lot of criticism in relation to it.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Jerome Hughes. We appreciate it. Well, let me introduce our guest for this edition of the debate. Author and lecturer Jonathan Fryer joins us from London. And we have publisher and editor at Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos, who joins us from London. I'd like to welcome you both. And Marcus Papadopoulos, let me start with you with the obvious questions. You have the three EU countries, the E3, who have launched this process, that they charge Iran with failing to observe the terms of the 2015 nuclear deal. At the same time, they said, well, we're doing this because we want to save the deal. Can you please explain the EU stance here?
Well, I consider the move by London, Paris and Berlin to trigger the dispute mechanism to be highly significant, highly suspicious and highly unconstructive, because it comes at a time when America is vitriolically denouncing Iran following Washington's murder of Qasem Soleimani, a man who played an instrumental role in the defeat of ISIS in Lebanon, Syria and Iraq, a proxy of the United States government and one of the most potent proxies that America has ever employed on the international stage. Now, it is my contention that behind the move of London, Paris and Berlin is America. Ultimately, America is trying to ratchet up more and more pressure on Iran. If we take Britain, well, to put it crudely, Britain is in effect a lackey of the United States. Britain is nothing more than an extension of American power. Britain is a willing tool of the Americans on the international stage. Returning to Paris and Berlin, I am disappointed by the actions of the French and the Germans, but nonetheless I'm not surprised, because while Paris and London seek to have greater independence from the Americans, ultimately France and Germany are strategic allies to the United States, and the Americans exert a lot of pressure on the Germans and the French. And I would conclude that the move by Paris and Berlin today demonstrates that Germany and France have given in to pressure from the Americans, because ever since America pulled out of the JCPOA nearly 2 years ago, the Americans have been doing their utmost to try and persuade Germany and France to stop trading with Iran, to stop investing with Iran. And in essence, they have been attempting to blackmail the Germans and the French by saying, if you want to keep on trading with Iran and investing in Iran, then that could jeopardize your access to the American market. And the American market, of course, is one of the most important in the world. It is a market of 300 million people. So I think the decision by the German government and the French government today to trigger this dispute mechanism really demonstrates that the Germans and the French have caved in to pressure from the Americans. And it is quite simply infantile and deceitful for the Americans and, of course, for the British to allege that Iran has failed to comply with the JCPOA. No, Iran has fully complied with the nuclear deal since its inception. There is a crisis today regarding the JCPOA, but that is not a crisis caused by Iran. That is a crisis caused by America, America's withdrawal. And I said in 2018, and I say today, that I believe in the long term, without America being a signatory to the JCPOA, then in the long term, the agreement is dead.
Okay, Jonathan Fryer, unfortunately we didn't get that ending statement you made there because of a bad audio connection or video connection. Jonathan Fryer, this is the whole crust of it right now when you take a look at what the Europeans have done. I mean, they're telling Iran, we're going to go for this snapback, and at the same time, they haven't done anything except for what they made an announcement on, which was Instex, which only a few $1 million has gone through that mechanism, which was supposed to evade the U.S. sanctions. But yet, Iran is being punished for it. Iran is being portrayed as the bad guy. Does that make sense to you?
Well, only to a certain degree. I think your correspondent in Brussels absolutely correctly judged the mood that there is in Europe now, that the European powers, France, Germany, and perhaps surprisingly even Britain, are very keen to save the JCPOA, or if necessary to come up with some sort of revised version for it. Let's be clear about what's happened with the so-called dispute resolution mechanism. Basically, it is in a sense a warning to Iran to say that if Iran were to go ahead and increase the amount of enriched uranium, which has been suggested might happen, then this could would be in violation, as they see it, of the agreement itself. So in a sense, it's a a move by the Europeans to try to persuade the Iranians not to walk away from the deal, while at the same time trying to say to the Americans that Europe is trying to do something positive. I don't agree with Marcus that Europe is completely the lackey of the United States on this issue. The European countries have been very strong in their determination to try to preserve the Iran nuclear deal and indeed to get round some of the sanctions that the Americans have imposed. And I said I was surprised even that Britain was joining in because, of course, Prime Minister Boris Johnson is a close friend of Donald Trump, and one might have expected him to back the Americans 100% on this, but he hasn't. Basically, he's also saying that there should be a deal, but suggesting that perhaps there could be certain modifications to what was agreed in 2015 in order to try and get the Americans back on board.
Okay. Well, before we continue, we have an interesting soundbite that we'd like to listen to, which involves the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the EU Foreign Policy Chief, the new EU Foreign Policy Chief, or maybe not so new EU Foreign Policy Chief, Borrell. Let's take a listen.
The debate.
My point to our American friends is, look, somehow or other, we've got to stop the Iranians acquiring a nuclear weapon. I think that's what the Joint Collective Points Agreement does, the JCPOA. But if we're going to get rid of it, then we need a replacement. From the American perspective, it's a flawed agreement, it expires, plus it was negotiated by President Obama. Let's replace it, and let's replace it with the Trump deal.
Okay.
That's what we need to see. Let's work together to replace the JCPOA and get the Trump deal instead.
The aim of the dispute resolution mechanism is not to reimpose sanctions. The aim of this mechanism is to resolve issues relating to the implementation of the agreement. Let me say this clearly. The dispute resolution mechanism, which is going to be triggered now, is not about reimposing sanctions.
The debate.
So there you had it, two statements there which speak volumes. Before I get to you, Marcus Papadopoulos, do you still think, Jonathan Farr, that the UK in particular is not a lapdog of the US when you have the Prime Minister saying, let's put the Trump deal, replace it with the EU JCPOA deal?
Well, certainly, like many people in Britain, I shivered when I heard that expression, Trump deal. Clearly, he was intending that message to go to Washington to try to appeal to Donald Trump to come on board with some sort of deal. He reflected something that's absolutely true, which is that Donald Trump hates the Iran nuclear deal most of all because President Obama signed it, and he always keeps on talking about his President Obama's lousy deal. But of course, it would be disastrous to call it the Trump deal. There's no way that Iran could sign something called the Trump deal. That is ridiculous.
Okay, I'd like to get also your reaction, Marcus Papadopoulos, but at the same time, we've put these two statements together because it also shows a division that exists between the EU Foreign Policy Chief, in this case, that's supposed to represent all of Europe, and in particular with the Prime Minister, the EU saying we want to save this deal, and the EU Prime Minister saying we need to replace this deal.
And let me clarify something first of all. I never said that the Germans or the French are lackeys of the United States. I said that Britain is a lackey of the United States. And that is correct. The UK is a vassal state of the United States of America. And I know that Iranians and Iraqis and Syrians, for instance, will understand this when I say that the British on the international stage are not two-faced, they are multi-faced. They are unbelievably disingenuous. And they are people who, on the one hand, they smile in front of you, but behind your backs, they often put the dagger into your back. Now, turning to what Prime Minister Boris Johnson said today, when I heard it, I simply thought to myself, this is another example of how infantile, of how unintelligent this man is, certainly when it concerns foreign affairs. But it also shows how the British are distorting the truth, because the JCPOA is a very good deal. It is a sound agreement. It has done wonders to do something about increasing or inserting a level of stability in the Middle East. There is no problem with the JCPOA. The reason why there is a crisis with the JCPOA is because Donald Trump hates the JCPOA and he seeks its destruction. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons, but one of them is because he has very extensive and intensive personal ties to Saudi Arabia and to Israel. And both Riyadh and Tel Aviv want to see the destruction of the Islamic Revolution. So it is not in their interests to see the JCPOA survive in the long term. But also when we hear Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab saying that it is imperative that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons, well, Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the same can't be said for Israel. So why is it that Washington and London are happy for Israel to have nuclear weapons in the most volatile part of the world, but at the same time they say it is not acceptable for Iran to have nuclear weapons? I don't want to see any country in the region and any country elsewhere in the world to have nuclear weapons, but we have to be balanced. If Iran cannot develop nuclear weapons, which I do not believe it wants to, it is enriching uranium for civilian purposes, but if Iran is not allowed to have nuclear weapons, then Israel should not be allowed to have nuclear weapons. So the Americans and the British, once again, they are being disingenuous.
Jonathan Fryer, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what has happened here. Now, we've seen since the U.S. pulled out of the deal, first of all, Iran waited a year and a few months before they took any action. They were waiting. They were waiting to see what the Europeans would do. The promise of Instex came around. The formation was announced, but that was a couple of years ago. Well, nothing happened. You have Iran's reaction to be the scaling back, which it has done up to this point on a number of occasions. First of all, why would Europe pick this particular time to make this decision? That's a question mark here. But more importantly, again, the reaction so far by Iran has been scaling back its commitments. Of course, Iran has made a statement saying that, the E3, by doing this, has said that we're going to make our move and Europe is going to be suffering the consequences from what they have done. What do you think those consequences may be?
Well, obviously, one of the consequences would be heightened tension in the region, which is bad for everybody, including Europe. And it would be a bad blow, unfortunately, for European diplomacy if indeed the Iran nuclear deal did ultimately collapse. I do believe sincerely that here in Europe, most governments firmly want there to be a situation in which there is restored peace and security in the region, and certainly the JCPOA was a very useful instrument for reassuring many others in the region. And so I, of course, understand, particularly in the context of the Middle East and the heightened rhetoric that is often used not only in Iran but in the Arab world as well, that often harsh words are said, but I think that what we need to look at is the actual reality behind those words, because we've also had really quite positive conciliatory statements from other parts of the Iranian government, not least from the foreign ministry, basically saying, and indeed from the office of the president, Mr. Rouhani, basically saying that it is in everybody's interest to find a good way forward.
Well, Marcus Papadopoulos, that is the next question. What's next? Obviously, we're going to have to wait for Iran's reaction. We've heard what Russia has reacted, how they have reacted, and it's pretty gloomy. I'm going to quote what Russia has says, that it sees no grounds to trigger dispute resolution mechanism on nuclear deal with Iran. Iranian foreign minister stating that it's a strategic mistake. Where to next, do you think?
The JCPOA is a milestone for peace and stability in the Middle East. And anyone who is sincere in wanting to see tension in the most volatile part of the world decrease should JCPOA. Iran has fully complied with the agreement. Iran fully supports the agreement. I believe that Germany and France fully support the agreement. Britain, yes, on the one hand, they have expressed their support to the agreement, but as I said moments ago, you can't trust Britain on the international stage. Britain is a very duplicitous player. So what we need to see now is Iran's request that the British, French and the Germans create the means by which Iran is allowed to export its oil, because at the moment there are severe restrictions on Iran's ability to do that because of the sanctions that Trump has placed on Iran. So that is why in recent times Iran has started enriching uranium. And I should clarify something. In the JCPOA, there is a clause which permits Iran to start the process of enriching uranium if the other parties to the deal fail to comply with the agreement. So that is why Iran is doing it. But let me clarify something else. Iran is enriching uranium, yes, for civilian purposes.
Okay.
Iran never walked away from the agreement. Could you imagine the uproar in Washington and London if Iran had walked away from the agreement? No, Iran is still a party to the agreement. It is the Americans who walked away from the agreement. Therefore, it is the Americans that should have the wrath of people in the world who support peace and stability, or efforts to achieve peace and stability in the Middle East.
Okay. Jonathan Fryer, I've saved, I think, one of the best questions for last. And that is, one of the things that the U.S. wants to do in their vantage point, reel in Iran's missile program. Now, we have seen the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, of which you're well aware of. Now, imagine if Iran did not have a missile program that it could retaliate with. After the U.S. threatened Iran that it would target 52 sites inside the Islamic Republic.
Yes, well, certainly every country, including the Islamic Republic of Iran, have the right for self-defense and to have adequate military means to self-defend. And certainly, I don't think it would be easy to find many people here in Britain who would agree with the stance that Donald Trump has taken, or indeed with the argument that came out of Washington that Americans were under imminent threat from Qasem Soleimani. There's no evidence at all that that was the case. And I think one thing maybe that Marcus and I would agree with is that probably the best way forward out of all this situation is if in the American elections in November Donald Trump is defeated and someone a little more reasonable gets into the White House.
Okay. I want to ask who you would think. All right, very well. We'll leave it there. Thank you. Author and lecturer Jonathan Fryer. There, publisher and editor at Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos. Thank you for your comments. And that does for this edition of The Debate. From me, the entire team, it's goodbye. Until next time.